Welcome back. Now, as Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is set to deliver his maiden mid-term budget policy statement later today, the question of funding social security remains a pertinent one in the country. Now, this as civil society organisations are crying foul over a reported proposal by government to introduce a family grant that would replace the 350 Rand COVID-19 social relief of distress grant. Now, this would reportedly be paid to the so-called heads of households. To help us unpack some of these developments and also just look forward to what to expect, we're joined now by Isobel Frye, who is the Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Isobel, good to speak to you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and to your viewers. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Isobel, let's just start with something that we had as a question of the day yesterday, this proposal of a grant that would be paid to the heads of family. Now, it seems as though there's nothing officially on the table, but of course government hasn't come out to deny either that such a proposal was made or did or does exist. So what do we know about this? What do you know about this at the moment?
Thanks, Sakina, and I think that you really put your finger on a critical point when it comes to policy making. I think today we're looking at the numbers, but we know that for millions of people, this is not about numbers, this is about livelihoods. And any kind of indication or messaging brings a huge amount of anxiety for people, for the 8.5 million people who are currently receiving the social relief of distress grant, to hear these kind of rumors. And that's really what it is right now, about the fact that this is coming to an end. What's going to happen is really cruel, I think, at the best of times. So what we do know is that the current 350 Rand social relief of distress grant is coming to an end at the end of March next year, at the end of this financial year. With regards to what it's going to be replaced by, that's the big question mark. And it's really interesting. I was just thinking in preparation for this conversation, when the social relief of distress grant was introduced, a lot of the people within Treasury were objecting to the fact that once you introduce something like this, it's very difficult to roll it back. Now, on the one hand, that's very true, but it's true because firstly, there is a demonstrated need for the 350 Rand at least. There is a demonstrated need that 13 million people live below the food poverty line of 600 Rand per person per month. Secondly, there's a demonstrated right. There's a constitutional right to social security. And thirdly, there actually is the affordability. So we have the need, the right, and the affordability. And that is why many of us in civil society are saying you can't just unilaterally, behind closed doors and without consultation, change policies which has such a drastic effect. I mean, we're looking right now at something which goes to between 8 and 9 million people. That would be rolled back significantly, and single household heads, which we know tend to prefer men within households, so undermines women's decision-making ability, might receive a grant. Now, when we engaged with the Minister of Finance in NetLife last Friday and asked him about the future of the family grant and the social relief of distress grant, his view was, what he said is that the social relief of distress grant comes to an end at the end of March, and really that's all that is certain. Now, the MTBPS is there to signal changes in the budget. And I think that we see this as a very positive sign that we're open for engagement. And right now we have 3 or 4 econometricians who are doing some modelling to look at what is affordable. Because right now we know that with the poverty in South Africa, for 100 billion Rand, we could pay a social relief or distress grant equivalent to every person falling below the food poverty line. In effect, in one policy, Sakina, we could wipe out basic poverty in South Africa. Now, that's what everyone is saying we want to do. We want to see the political will going behind the statements of intent that open every State of the Nation address, every official function. We know that poverty is crippling us in South Africa, and it's destroying families and it's destroying our future. This is something we can do to wipe it out.
Isobel, I know we need to let you go, but just very briefly with regard to some of the possible replacements to the social relief of distress grant, as you say, the one certainty is that it will come to an end early next year. So There has been quite a bit of talk about a basic income grant and some advocating for a universal basic income grant. So quickly, in terms of that, just your views on that, firstly, and also, again, if you look at, the opinion pieces in newspapers, etc., you would find it is clear that those who are so-called mainstream economists will every time say why this can't be done, why this is not affordable. There is, of course, a school of thought that also says you cannot have a nation that is so wholly dependent on handouts from the government. But what is your view on this? And should this be something that South Africa should forge ahead with?
It's a very good question, and I think it's one which we have reflected on, you and I, on a number of occasions beforehand. I have great sympathy with the fact that we don't want to just be continually paying out monies on the one hand. On the other hand, that's what governments do. Governments raise money from people and they distribute it to their citizens. Now, another conversation that I had at NetLife was that about the question of pro-poor policy. Now, on the one hand, people view pro-poor policies, as I think the Minister of Finance does, as all the money that goes towards poor people. For many of us who are steeped in social policy, pro-poor policy are the policies that actually move people out of poverty through participating in a program. The transformation, the catalyst, enables people to move into a more resilient state in which they're able to, as I say, move away from that dependency that you spoke about. And I think for me, the social relief of distress versus basic income grant is a really good example of that. Now, the social relief of distress is a payment of 350, and we're hoping that in March next year or April it comes back in line with inflation, 365. But it goes to meet people's basic needs, and that's as much as it can do. It doesn't even meet that. Whereas a universal basic income grant, especially one slightly more, such as the higher bound poverty line, upper bound poverty line of 1,300 rand, gives enough people enough money not only to meet their basic needs, but to start to generate economic activity. And so in participating in the spending of the money that comes through the universal grant, you actually enable people to move to a higher level of economic activity. And from the research that we've done at SPY, it's very clear that the GDP growth that will operate as a result of such a distribution of income, because it enables people not just to be sitting and receiving, but to be actively promoting and changing their own lives. That's really something that we want to move for. And so, I just want to really urge people at this point in time, we have a critical problem in South Africa around poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Instead of just making blanket, sweeping assumptions and statements around what kind of policies are good, why don't we start piloting those? We have enough people who are able to participate in this. We can take a number of different locations and say, let's try a household grant. Let's try a lower bound poverty line grant. Let's try an upper bound poverty line grant, and link in through micro policies the kind of skills crowding in so that we can change. It is almost as if the policymakers are too scared to test the assumptions that we have. We need to move out of this situation. We cannot come back year on year on year, looking at the increasing numbers of unemployed, looking at the increasing numbers of people living in starvation, and think that nothing will change. 2 nights ago, I went to the launch of that book, 8 Days in July, in which the authors, and shout out to them for getting out a book so rapidly, they spoke about the fact that we live in a society in which we are on the brink of an outburst at any moment. We cannot pledge that to our children, and we certainly cannot have that coming forward as we start to rebuild after COVID. So today is a really important day, Sakina, and we need to see the kinds of boldness and courageous statements that we'd associated with our president at the beginning of COVID, and that we need to see that line being held by the Minister of Finance.
Isobel Frye, thank you so much, and of course your daughter waiting for you, so we'll release you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Isobel is the director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, and very critical discussions that we as South Africans need to engage in more broadly so that all these views are aired, so that we understand what we are dealing with. But of course, as Isobel also points out, chronic problems of unemployment, of poverty and inequality, very much the story of South Africa, something that we cannot get away from. So how do we find our way or try to navigate our way out of it?